Bret Hart once said this about Triple H, and I'm going to give it to you exactly as he said it. I never thought Triple H ever had an idea, original idea for anything. Not in a wrestling promo, not scripted. In a real interview, years after both men had left the ring behind, and Bret Hart isn't the only Hall of Famer who said something like that about the man who now runs WWE's entire creative direction. So today, we're not doing storyline analysis. We're building a case file, real quotes, real interviews, real testimony from wrestlers who worked with him, and by the end, you can be the judge of what actually happened. This isn't about picking a side before we start. It's about laying out exactly what's been said, by who, and why. Because the truth here is a lot more complicated than everybody hates him, or it's all jealousy. Before we get into testimony number 1, if breakdowns like this are your thing, go ahead and subscribe now. There's a lot more of this coming. Exhibit A, the Kliq. To understand any of this, you have to go back to the mid-90s. Yes, Triple H was one of 4 core members of a backstage group called the Kliq, alongside Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall, a friendship circle that also happened to have real influence over Vince McMahon's ear. In 1996, the group broke one of wrestling's oldest unwritten rules by hugging each other in the ring at Madison Square Garden after a match in full view of the crowd while playing on-screen enemies. It was treated as a massive act of disrespect to the business, and when Nash and Hall left for WCW shortly after, Triple H reportedly took the fall, allegedly getting pulled from a planned King of the Ring win as a punishment for the group's behavior. That's the origin story. A tight friend group with real backstage pull, years before Triple H ever married into the McMahon family. Exhibit B, Bret Hart. Hart's issues with Triple H go back to that same Kliq era, and he's never softened his position. In multiple interviews over the years, Hart has called Triple H overrated, questioned whether he ever had an original creative idea, and even ripped his acclaimed WrestleMania 28 match against The Undertaker, calling it mediocre. Hart's core argument, stated plainly, the reason people even know him or remember him today is because daddy-in-law, he's referring, of course, to Vince McMahon becoming his father-in-law after Triple H married Stephanie McMahon in 2003. Exhibit C, Booker T. This one's less about words and more about what actually happened on screen. At WrestleMania 19 in 2003, Booker T, a 5-time WCW World Champion by that point, went into the match against Triple H with a genuinely compelling underdog story. In the build-up, Triple H's character used lines aimed at Booker that many fans and critics read as having racial undertones, including a moment where he threw change at Booker in a bathroom segment and told him, "People like you don't become world champion." Triple H won the match clean, pinning Booker with a pedigree. WWE and figures like Bruce Pritchard have since denied any racial framing was intended, but the storyline remains one of the most heavily criticized angles of that era, specifically because of how it played out with Triple H going over. Exhibit D, Rob Van Dam, RVD, has been one of the most consistent voices here. Speaking on the Two-Man Power Trip of Wrestling podcast, he explained his frustration directly. It's not fair just because he's with the boss's daughter. RVD's specific grievance was around 2001 and 2002, during what's often referred to as Triple H's reign of terror, a period where he held the world title for extended stretches, while rising stars like Van Dam had their momentum stall out. Van Dam has since walked some of this back, admitting in later years that Triple H was, in his words, a really good wrestler, and that they actually had great matches together. That nuance matters. This isn't a case of eternal hatred, it's frustration that cooled with time and hindsight. Exhibit E, Chris Jericho. On the Kurt Angle show, Jericho was fairly direct about the political undertones of working with Triple H during their overlapping prime years, saying flatly, there was a lot of politics at that time, and suggesting Triple H may have used backstage influence in ways that affected his position on the card. Unlike some of the others on this list, Jericho's tone has generally stayed more measured, professional criticism rather than personal animosity. Exhibit F, CM Punk. This is probably the most publicly documented case of real tension turning into must-watch television. On his Art of Wrestling podcast with Colt Cabana, Punk didn't hold back, recounting a moment where he told Triple H to his face, "I seriously resent you for not putting me over 3 years ago when you should have." That resentment traced back to WWE's Summer of Punk storyline in 2011, which fans initially loved, but which eventually fizzled out with Punk losing clean to Triple H at Night of Champions. Reports have also circulated over the years, suggesting Triple H mocked Punk backstage early in his career when Punk was still wrestling dark matches trying to break in. Whatever the full truth, the on-screen chemistry between the two, genuine heat translating into gripping promos, became one of the more electric storylines of that period. Here's a question worth sitting with before we move to the verdict. If this many wrestlers across 3 completely different eras are saying some version of the same thing, is that a pattern? Or is that just what happens to anyone who stays at the top of a locker room for over 2 decades? Exhibit G, Alberto Del Rio. Del Rio's departures from WWE were messier than most, and in interviews since, he specifically pointed to Triple H as someone who, in his words, tried to bury him backstage, particularly around the controversy over his real-life relationship with Paige. Del Rio claims Vince McMahon was actually his biggest backstage supporter, which puts him at odds, specifically with Triple H, rather than the company as a whole. Exhibit H, Paul London, perhaps the most publicly bitter of the group. London has said he'll never work for WWE again, largely because of how he felt treated by Triple H, including a widely remembered Raw segment where Triple H hit both London and his tag partner Brian Kendrick with pedigrees after they'd come out to help him. London later criticized Triple H's in-ring work directly, echoing Bret Hart's sentiment, and specifically called out how Triple H inserted himself into Kevin Owens' Universal Championship celebration moment, calling it disingenuous. Quick pause here. If you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful, drop a comment telling me which testimony surprised you most, because I want to know if it's the Booker T angle or the CM Punk resentment that lands hardest with you. Exhibit 1, the modern context. Here's where the story gets more interesting, because Triple H himself has acknowledged this pattern isn't hidden. It's just business as usual to him. Asked directly about backstage politicking as recently as the WWE Raw Netflix launch, he responded candidly, "That's every day. I've had that conversation with every single talent about everything we do." He's also publicly admitted, following the 2025 Survivor Series War Games match, that there was real backstage tension and lobbying among stars like Brock Lesnar, Roman Reigns, and CM Punk over entrance order and screen time, calling it something you could cut with a knife. So this isn't ancient history. Reports continue to surface even now about tension between Triple H and other major figures, including The Rock, according to comments from former wrestler D'Lo Brown and broadcaster Jonathan Coachman, both suggesting the two simply don't get along behind the scenes despite their on-screen alliance. So here's the actual verdict laid out honestly. Some of this is genuine, personal, well-documented resentment. Booker T's storyline, Punk's Summer of Punk fallout, London's pedigree moment. Some of it is decades-old Kliq-era politics that never fully healed, like Bret Hart's grudge, and some of it is simply the natural byproduct of one man staying centrally positioned in WWE's hierarchy for over 25 years, first as a wrestler, then as an executive, which guarantees that some people who didn't get the push they wanted are going to point at the person closest to the decision-making. It's not one simple story. It's several different ones that happen to share the same name at the center. What's your honest take? Is this mostly legitimate grievance or mostly the natural resentment that comes with staying on top for this long? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want the next deep dive the moment it drops, make sure you're subscribed. There's a lot more of these real backstage stories still to cover.